In this lesson, as promised, we'll be setting up rendering for our location messages to render a link instead of showing the entire URL. Now to get that done, we're going to want to render a separate template, which means we're going to want to create a separate event that the server sends to the client so we can have separate logic for that. So instead of message, we'll use something else, like location message. Now, getting this done is going to be your first of 2 challenges for the lesson, and the reason I'm breaking it up into 2 challenges is that the second challenge already contains quite a bit, so this first one will be a little light, then the second one will contain a bit more work for you to do. Right here, your goal is to create that separate event for location sharing messages. So the server is going to emit the location message event when it's trying to share one of those Google Maps URLs, and it should emit the event with the URL like it's doing now. Then on the client in this file, you want to set up a listener that runs some code when it receives the location message event, and what you want to do for the moment is just print the URL to the console. Now that's not rendering it in a new template, that is the second challenge, we'll get to that shortly. Down below, test your work. So you should be able to share a location, and you should no longer see it showing up above, you should only see it showing up in the console down below. Since when you share a location, it should fire your new event handler and not the one right here. So take some time to knock that out and test your work. When you're done, come back and click play. All right, how'd that go? Let's kick things off by making that change to the server. So over in index.js, we get the location somewhere over here, send location. This is what we want to change. Right now, we are emitting message from server to client, and we use that for a lot of other things where we have text we want to show. In this case, the data is a bit different, so we're going to emit a separate event that would be location message. Now that's the only thing we need to change over here, not too bad. Over in chat.js, we have to listen for that event, and I'm going to add that just below our listener for message. So that would be socket.on, right here, location message. Then we set up our function and we get access to our data, which I will call URL, or you could call it something similar like maps URL. And then down below, the only thing I wanted you to do was just print it to the console, so that's exactly what we'll do. Now with this in place, we can test our work. What I'm going to do is refresh the browser. I'll send a regular message and it works as expected. I'll then try to share my location and I should not see it up above. I should only see it in the console down below, and that is exactly what I'm getting, which is great. So now we've proven that our other event handler is running when we are getting a location that's been shared with us. And since we have separate code to run, we can render a separate template, including a link with custom text. And that is what we're going to focus on for the second of the 2 challenges. So right here, I'm going to remove the old challenge comments and I'll take some time to paste in the new ones. Right here, your job for the second challenge is to render a new template for location messages. We're just going to show a link that links to the Google Maps page when someone clicks it. So right here, you're going to start by duplicating the message template in index.html and changing the ID to something that makes sense for that template, as you're going to need to select it from inside of JavaScript. Next, you're going to actually alter the template's content. In that paragraph, what you're going to do is add a link using the A anchor element, and the text for the link will be static, something like my current location, and the URL, the href attribute, will be dynamic, so for the value of that, you want to make sure to use that curly braces syntax. Next up, you want to move into chat.js and select the template from JavaScript, and you want to render the template with the Google Maps URL. So the URL that I have right here, that should find its way into the href attribute for the link we're creating in the new template. Finally, you're going to make sure that template gets appended to the message list and you'll test your work. So over here, if I send off a text message, that should show up. If I send off my location, I should see a blue clickable link that brings me over to the Google Maps page. All right, take as much time as you need to get that done. I know there are quite a few steps. When you are done, come back and click play. How'd that go? Let's get to it by first creating that new template and setting it up with the link. So over in index.html, we'll be taking our current script element. I'll be copying it to the clipboard, and down below, we're going to go ahead and paste it in. And right here, we'll just do a little reformatting, bringing it back to what it was before. And we do have to change the ID so we can target these two separately. I'll call this one something like location message template. Perfect. Now, when it comes to actually altering the template, what I wanted you to do was to put a link inside. So for that, I would go ahead and set up an A tag, opening and closing it. And I would put the link text right in between the opening and closing tags. And for this one, something like my current location would get the job done, though you could have used different text that would have been perfectly fine. Now, the attribute you have to configure is href. This is the link where someone goes when they click that link. And in this case, we want them to go to a dynamic URL that'll be provided to the template, which means you needed to use this syntax right inside of these double quotes. So right here, 2 opening curly braces followed by 2 closing curly braces, and I will eventually pass in a URL value once I render this template. Now, with this in place, we're actually done, but there's one more change we can make. It wasn't part of the challenge. Right here, you can go ahead and set target equal to _blank. That's going to open the link in a new tab, which means that you won't leave the chat room. By default, the same tab will switch from the chat room over to Google Maps, which is probably not what you want. So take a moment to add that in. It's a nice user interface improvement. Next up, in chat.js, we can move on to step number 3. We have 1 and 2 done. We just have to select that template before we can render it. So right here, a new constant. I'm going to call this location message template, and I will grab it using document.querySelector. I'm going to select by ID, and the ID I just picked was location message template, and then we'll go ahead and use the inner HTML property. Perfect. Now that we have the template selected, it's time to actually render it. So down below, inside of onLocationMessage, we want to compile the template with the data and then get it showing up at the bottom of our list. So right here, a new constant HTML equals. Once again, we need to use mustache.render to render the template. That is the location message template. And remember, we said that we're going to pass in the URL, so we have to pass in our object with a URL value. Now we have a parameter with the same name up above, so we can use the shorthand syntax for that. And from here, all we need to do is to add this HTML to the document. So like we did above, that is messages dot insert adjacent HTML. We're going to insert our HTML before the end, so at the bottom of the list, and I have the HTML in the HTML variable up above. Now with this in place, we should be all done and we can test our work. So what I'm going to do is remove the challenge comments right here. I'm going to save chat.js and make sure my other files are saved as well. And in the browser, I'm going to refresh things. Now I'll start with a standard message, something like a regular text message, which does show up. And don't worry, I'll show you how to disable the autocomplete since it doesn't really make sense for this field. We'll cover that a bit later. And then we're going to click Send Location to test our new functionality. Now it takes a little bit of time to get that location, but once it's fetched, we have our link. And if I click that, it brings me over to Google Maps in a separate tab. Over here, I still have my chat application in place, which is great. Now, the location over here is close enough to where I actually am. It is definitely pretty accurate. So now that we have this in place, we have a separate template rendering for those location messages. allowing us to render a nice link to the user as opposed to just dumping the URL text to the screen. With this in place, we are now done with the 2 challenges for this lesson, and we're going to continue on to the next lesson, where the focus is going to be on timestamps. We're going to talk about how we can set up timestamps for the messages and then get some useful time information for when all of the messages were sent. I'm excited to get to that, so let's go ahead and jump right in.